Today's video will compare and contrast a model view controller with separation of concerns. Hello, I'm James Helfrich. Not only is a model view controller, otherwise known as MVC, the most commonly recognized design pattern, but is also perhaps the most commonly misunderstood. This video will compare and contrast the MVC with the broader category of design patterns called separation of concerns. You see, when the Gang of Four invented the MVC about 25 years ago, they had a very specific implementation in mind. Now, this implementation is not the most common variant of the separation of concerns. However, other people call their variations the MVC. Let's talk about the differences. Separation of concerns is the process of dividing the three responsibilities of a class: to store data, perform business logic, and implement public interfaces into separate classes for the purpose of making the design more cohesive, less redundant, and more adaptable. Now, first is the storage, and this is how the data is stored in the system. The business logic governs the rules pertaining to how data is manipulated, and the interface makes it convenient for the client to use the data. Now, there's lots of different ways we can integrate the different concerns. One of them is called the linear composition, where the interface has an instance of the business logic, which has an instance of the storage. Linear aggregation, where the interface has a reference to the business logic, which then has a reference onto the storage. Circular, where the interface sends data to business logic, which sends data to storage, which then sends data to the interface. Ad hoc, where basically everyone communicates with everyone directly. And then finally, there's a model view controller. And the model view controller is a type of circular, except there are some important modifications. And we're going to talk about that here today. So first of all, let's take a look at the data flow diagram pertaining to the MVC. Now we have the interface, otherwise known as the view in the MVC. And then we have the business logic, otherwise known as the controller. And then we have the storage, which is the model. Now, the interface is going to send input to the business logic, and the business logic notifies that displays need to be updated. And the business logic sends updates to the storage. And the storage then notifies the interface that information has been updated. And this is done through the observer design pattern. And the interface, of course, can request data from the storage model also through the observer design pattern. All this together is called the MVC. And the client interacts through the MVC solely through the interface. Now let's take a look at the same thing again, this time through the perspective of a class diagram. So we're going to have the interface, we're going to have the business logic, and we're going to have the storage classes. Now, the interface is going to have an instance of the business logic. So if the interface needs to send data to the business logic, it can, and there's going to be exactly one of those. And the business logic is going to have many possible interfaces. For an example, if there's a web interface, a network interface, and a file interface, then each one of those is going to be a different interface, and the business logic will talk to each one of those, and so there could be many of those. Now, the business logic is going to send information to storage. So it's going to have an instance of storage, and there's going to be exactly one of those. Now, what happens when storage wants to send information to the interface because something has changed? And this is where the observer design pattern comes into play. So the storage will have a collection of interfaces, and each one will be notified through the observer design pattern. Of course, there's a lot more to the MVC, and you can learn about that in the MVC section of the Separation of Concerns chapter of the Software Design textbook.